Well, good day everybody, and welcome to what really is your second last web clinic in this particular series. And boy, have we covered a lot of ground. So in fact, just in the last two of the web clinics, we've looked at the sales coaching revenue formula, where we looked at boosting productivity, increasing quality or the capability of your salespeople. And today we're really going to look at the final piece of that puzzle, being the motivational quotient. So I'm really excited about today because it's going to answer a lot of questions that you have with regards how to motivate your sales team. So all that being said, let's just dive straight into it, shall we, and see what we've got for you here today. So as per usual, I'm just going to do a quick review as where we've been so far. And really the purpose of this is just to kind of give you a gauge as to where you potentially should be in terms of your learning. Now, if you're not there, don't stress about it, but this is just to give you the track to run on. So you should have had by now at least 5 of your 6 personal implementation coaching sessions. You would definitely by now have completed your skills audit and one-on-ones with your salespeople, coming up with a skills development plan. You've also been through 5 web clinics, and of course we've had 4 conference coaching calls. By now you've also set clear expectations and boundaries with all your team, and that's really going to be important when we go into today, because one of the primary aspects of motivation is your team knowing exactly what is expected of them. And in fact the opposite is also true. So if they don't know what's expected of them, then that actually leaks motivation. And also by now you would have run your highly productive sales teams only play above the line training session with your team. And then 2 web clinics ago, we covered off sales productivity and of course auditing your sales pipeline. So I'm hoping you've had the opportunity to conduct those 2 audits, the one audit being of the way your people currently are spending their time, and the other audit is the audit of your sales pipeline. So hopefully you've gotten to that by now. If you haven't, please make a note in your diary right now, set aside a couple of hours next week and get it done. Folks, this is important. This will make a big difference to your ability to achieve your numbers this quarter. And then finally, as an action from the last web clinic on capability, you've sat down with one of your sales team and the 2 of you have started to work through the 9 steps to increasing their capability. Increase their capability. Let me just refresh your memory one more time. We look at how we use sales coaching to increase sales revenue, and of course for that we use the profitable sales revenue formula, which is revenue at margin equals productivity multiplied by quality multiplied by motivation. Now, we've already covered off the productivity piece of the puzzle, and of course last time we got together we looked at the quality piece of the puzzle, and like I said, today our focus is going to be on the motivation piece. Let me just reiterate that an increase in either the P or the Q or the M will ultimately translate into increased sales. Now, when you are able to apply pressure to all 3, to productivity, to quality, and to the motivation piece of the formula, that's when you get exponential growth. So often I get the question with sales managers who've been coaching their people for quite a while, what do I coach them on? Well, when you look at all the areas of productivity and all the areas of quality and all the areas that we can coach on in terms of motivation, this should keep you busy for at least 2 to 3 years. All right, so let's jump in and take a look at this thing called motivation. And you know what? For many, motivating a sales team is somewhat of a mystery. And I love the quote from one of my favorite all-time business teachers, a fellow by the name of Jim Rohn. And Jim says, motivation is a mystery. Why does one salesperson see his first prospect at 7 in the morning and another salesperson is just getting out of bed at 11? I don't know. It's just part of the mysteries of life. Well, it is a mystery, and I don't profess to give you all the answers today, but my goal is to give you some broad understanding of what those answers are, and at least provide you with some areas that you can actually go out and apply to make a difference in the motivation of your individual salespeople. So in today's web clinic, we're going to take a look at how do you drive the motivation of each individual salesperson on your sales team. And we're going to talk about what we call the motivational footprint of that individual. So what are the key things that actually turn that individual on and get them out of their chair and motivated? What are the motivators as well as what are their demotivators? And we're going to go through all of those today. And then we're going to take a look at the driving individual performance model. So the good news is we've actually, without you knowing it, covered off 3 areas of that model already. So now it's about filling in the gaps so that we can use the model in its entirety to drive the motivation of our salespeople. As part of today's session, we're also going to look at why people don't do what we expect of them. So even though we've gone through, we've had our expectations discussion, we lay down the law very clearly, how come some people still don't do what we ask of them? So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at the 16 reasons as to why they don't do what we ask of them, and we'll look at the steps that you need to take to deal with poor performance as well. So whilst this is not a performance management session per se, there are 4 key steps that you can take that will really help you to turn around this issue of poor performance. And then we're going to take a look at the whole concept around rewards and incentives and what are the extrinsic tools we use to drive motivation. And then finally, right at the end, I'm going to give you an exercise, the action steps that you need to take to drive the motivation of each individual within your sales team. A few years ago, when I wrote the book Bulletproof Your Sales Team, after a tremendous amount of research, we came to the conclusion that the strategy number 5, which was the final strategy that sales managers should use to drive sales forward, was all around how do we drive the motivation of the individual salesperson on the team. So I think it's important to note that there's an absolute plethora of information and research and studies out there that go towards demonstrating that when you put your focus on the individual, that's where you get the greatest boost, the greatest lift in motivation. So we know that the role of a manager in any workplace is to ensure that he or she gets their work done through the efforts of their team. And for a sales manager, that work is to achieve the results that are expected by the company sales plan. Now, the good news is, you know, if you've been following along with me so far, that the key then to achieving your results is, of course, increasing the productivity of your team, increasing their capability, and also increasing and improving their motivation. You see, the key to maintaining a highly motivated sales team is to understand each individual's intrinsic, in other words, their internal, as well as their extrinsic, in other words, their external motivational drivers. And so together, later on in our session today, we're going to explore that in much greater detail. So what does it take to motivate people? What does it take to get them out there selling every day? Well, you know, the answer to this age-old question is surprisingly simple. Your salespeople will do what you want them to do, not because you want them to do it, but because they want to do it. Now, that's a pretty profound statement. In fact, it's so profound, it bears repeating. Your people will do what they want to do, not because you told them to, but because they choose to do it themselves. They'll take themselves out of their comfort zone and they'll suit up for the challenge of selling because they choose to. No doubt we're all familiar with that age-old proverb that you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Well, in the book, Bulletproof Your Sales Team, I actually quote Dwight D. Eisenhower, who puts a different slant on it when he says that really motivation is the art of getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. Because when it comes right down to it, the horse will only drink if it's thirsty. Trying to motivate salespeople is really no different. In the end, they're only going to do something because they want to do it. So we know through years and years of study and research that human beings are all motivated and driven by different, what we call intrinsic, which are internal, and extrinsic, which are external needs and wants. And in fact, studies show that really the most effective way for us as sales leaders to motivate our salespeople lies in focusing in on and understanding each of our people as individuals. Because motivation begins with the individual. So when you listen to your salespeople's individual needs and concerns, that is really the first step towards creating a motivated sales team. The fact is, every one of your salespeople have their own motivational footprint. And as many a sales manager has discovered over the years, that really when you want to get a boost in your sales productivity, it's a whole lot harder than just simply dangling the financial carrot in front of them. Because let's face it, if financial incentives worked all the time, then whenever we needed sales, we'd just throw out some more money. And yet even knowing that, when you ask many sales managers and many really CEOs and managing directors, they will tell you that for the most part, salespeople are motivated by money. But while financial incentives might produce a spike in sales revenue from time to time, really, incentives and rewards don't work consistently, and the fact is they're really unsustainable. That being said, when you acknowledge your salespeople on an individual basis as human beings, that is really the first step to motivating them. Because each one of them has their own drive, their own needs, their own characteristics and personalities, and if you think about it, really their own individual reasons for choosing a career in sales in the first place. So we're going to look at how we discover each individual's own motivational footprint, because while some of your salespeople are easily able to articulate their motives, others struggle with that. However, every one of your salespeople have a reason why they've chosen selling as a career pathway. And it's your job as a sales manager to find out really what that motive is. And in a sense, this is no different really to selling, because as a salesperson, we need to identify what a prospect's motives are for wanting to invest in our products and our services. And we know certainly that everybody has a different buying agenda. And of course, when we're out there selling, the closer we can get to identifying what those buying motives are and why they want or need what it is we're selling, well, the closer we will be to actually making that sale. And this is really no different for us as sales managers. If we want to influence our people, we really need to know, we really need to identify what it is that drives them. What's going to get them out of bed? What's going to get them out into the field and selling for us? I mean, think about it for a moment. You know that there are a number of companies, and in fact, yours might even be one. And these companies collect a huge amount of data on their customers. They can tell you when their birthdays are. They can tell you when their wives' birthdays are. They can tell you where they like to go on vacation. And in fact, Harvey Mackay, the author of the best-selling book Swim with the Sharks, he writes about what he calls the Mackay 66, which in essence is a 66-question customer profile that focuses on the person who does the buying. So what are they like as a human being? What are they proud of accomplishing? What is their life like outside of the office? How do they want to be seen by others? In other words, as he says, what makes them tick? Because as Mackay says, once you've established that kind of relationship with an individual, then you make it really, really tough for your competitors to get a foothold. And in fact, as he points out, it's really the only way to keep sales up and running during rough patches in the economy. And so Harvey Mackay summarizes his Mackay 66 philosophy by saying that knowing your customer doesn't just mean knowing their company goals. It means really knowing who they are, one human being to another. And how much more so should we take that same philosophy with our own people? How much do we really know about our own salespeople on an individual basis? Let's do an exercise right now. I want you to get out your handout. So this was the handout that came with the email invitation to this web clinic. You got it in front of you? Great. So find the Mackay 66, that questionnaire. Find that in your handout. Now, take a look at your handout. Take a look at the Mackay 66 and take a look at those questions. How many of those questions could you answer right now about your salespeople? So with that in mind, I want to introduce you to an exercise that we call the motivational footprint. And this is really where you establish a profile of the way that your people like to be motivated. So what motivates them and really what demotivates them. In the book Bulletproof Your Sales Team on page 262, I actually write about the motivational footprint and I go in depth as to what it is and how you actually uncover the motivational footprint of each of the individual salespeople on your sales team. And in fact, you'll actually find all the questions that were written in the book, you'll actually find them in your handout for today's session. So you'll notice in the handout that the questions all fall into 11 different categories. So the first category we look at is what drives your individual salesperson, what drives them financially. Then we look at what motivates them to achieve their goals. We look at their need for personal development and growth. Is that a motivator for them? What is their current level of job engagement and satisfaction? What do they want from a work environment? How important for them is life balance? What kind of boss or what kind of employee relationship works best for them? Do they require variety in their week, or do they prefer stability in order to sustain their interest and attention? How important is the connection between what it is they do and the value that is provided by the products and services that you sell as an organization? How do they want to be recognized or acknowledged for top performance? You know, that reminds me, there's a great example of how we assume that everybody wants kind of the same things motivationally. So I'll never forget, about 4 years ago, I was working with an organization. They called me in because their top performer had actually gone off the boil. So here was a woman that had consistently delivered in excess of her sales budget, her sales target, month after month, and in fact year after year. However, something had happened and she'd gone off the boil and hadn't been delivering top sales results now for over 6 months, and nobody could find out what was going on, what was wrong. The problem was that the previous year they'd set up this awards night to recognize their top producers. And what had happened was, because she was a top producer, she was called up on stage and given all the accolades and hand claps and all the rest of the attention that goes along with being on stage, a bit like Oscar night. But unfortunately, when I spoke to her, she found the whole experience completely traumatic. She hated the whole experience. She was embarrassed to be up there in front of the whole organization. She didn't enjoy the publicity. So as a result, guess what? She started to underperform, so that really she would never again have to undergo what she remembers as a really traumatic and painful event. And obviously the lesson that we can draw from this example is that everybody is motivated differently. And as a sales manager, we need to motivate each of our salespeople as individuals. So what's the action? What can we learn from this? What can we take back into our teams and apply? Well, essentially, you need to have an individual motivational driver discussion with each member of your sales team. And this one-on-one discussion is really a bit like having an interview, where the sole purpose of this interview is to unpack and really understand what are the key motivators and what are the key demotivators of the individual. So we've already said what drives them financially, what motivates them to achieve goals, what is their need for personal development and growth, what is their level of job engagement and satisfaction, how do your people want to be recognized and rewarded for superior performance, etc., etc., etc. In other words, what is their motivational footprint? What drives them and what demotivates them? You see, when you have answers to all the questions on the motivational footprint profile, you now know which buttons you need to press in order to optimize the motivation of each member of your sales team. This is the power of understanding their motivational footprint. And now whenever you want to ramp up production or get your people to do something, well, now you have a template. You now know what drives them. And so people, this is clearly very, very powerful information, because you can use it to manipulate, you can use it for good, or you could use it for evil. That's your choice. The key, though, is to understand the more you know about the individual salespeople that you're working with, the more you understand their drivers, that gives you now a tremendous ability to influence them for not just your own benefit, but for theirs too. Okay, good. So by now you understand that the way we motivate people is we have to do it one-on-one individually. And you also understand that everybody has a motivational footprint, and you've now got the tools to go and identify what your salespeople's motivational footprint is. Now I want to tease this out just a little bit further, and I'm going to walk you through the individual sales performance model. And the good news is that you've already covered off a number of these areas in previous trainings. So the place that individual sales performance begins is really where we began, with expectations. And as you recall, this was the subject of your very first one-on-one session. Firstly, figuring out what it is that you expected of your salespeople, and then having a one-on-one discussion where they tell you what they expect of you, and you tell them what you expect of them. And this is the genesis of individual motivation. This is where it all begins. Then last week we even looked at the second piece of the puzzle, which is, okay, now that I know what's expected of me, do I know how to do it? And so we looked at the capability piece of this puzzle. Just because I know you expect me to hit my targets on a monthly basis. Question, do I know how? Because if I did know how, wouldn't I be hitting my targets monthly? You know, there's a wonderful quote by Sanctus Germanus who says that if they knew better, they would do better. And I guess the question that we have to ask ourselves as sales managers is, if your people knew better, if they knew how, would they do better? Or even would they even do? And if at the end of that you turn around and say, well, no, they probably wouldn't, well, we're going to take a look at how we manage that response in just a while. But for right now, let's assume some responsibility here, because the bottom line is this. Most people have a need to succeed, and the truth is, if they knew how, they would do it. If they knew how to get over their feelings of fear in making cold calls, would they do it? Of course they would. If they knew how to ask just the right questions at just the right time, would they do it? Of course they would. If they knew how to close the sale at the appropriate time using an appropriate conversion question, would they? Of course they would. So the question then becomes, well, if they don't know how, then why not? And if they don't know how to do what it is that we expect of them, then the very first thing we've got to do is we have to set up a plan for them to gather the skills, to gather the knowledge in order to deliver on our expectations. And by the way, just while we're on this point, let me ask you a question. Whose responsibility is it to accumulate the knowledge, to accumulate the skills that the individual requires in order to meet your expectations. Who is responsible? My assumption is that when you hired the individual, you hired them because they had told you that they had the skills in order to do the job. And this is true in most cases. And by the way, even if this wasn't true in a particular instance, at the end of the day, that salesperson needs to get those skills in order for them to meet the needs of their role. So who's responsible for that? When you think about it, I think you'll come to the conclusion that in essence, the responsibility for developing those skills lies in the hands of the salesperson themselves. Now, as you recall, in the previous web clinic, we actually recommended that when you talk about skills, you actually have them go out and let them do the research, let them do the homework. This is about putting the responsibility back onto them. After all, they are the ones with the skill deficit. They are the ones that need the skills in order to fulfill the outcomes of their role. So if that's the case, then what is your responsibility? Well, as the sales coach, your responsibility is to help them plan and strategize how they're going to get access and grow their particular skill that is holding them back. Okay, so just for the purposes of this web clinic, let's assume that your people know exactly what they need to do in order to develop themselves so that they can deliver their required sales goals. Then the question we have to ask is, well, okay, if they know what to do and they know what we expect of them, and together we've come up with a plan for them to develop their skills so that they can ultimately deliver on our expectations, well then, why is it that some do and some don't? Why is it that some salespeople, knowing all of that, they know how to do it, they know it's expected, why is it that they can go out and do, whereas some make the choice not to do? And by the way, let me say that this problem isn't only restricted to sales managers. This is an age-old management enigma. Why is it that some people get out and do what we ask of them, and yet others, even though we're paying them, even though we've been very explicit in terms of what the role requires, they just choose not to? All right, so with that in mind now, let me shine a light on this issue, and let's take a look at why people don't. So here's what we know from industrial behavioral psychology. We know that there are two camps of people that don't do what it is we ask of them. So the first camp is made up of those people who just can't do it. And the second camp is made up of people who simply choose not to do it. So let's unpack each one of those individually so that you can get a better understanding, because at the end of this session, you're going to have the answers to actually tackling this issue. So let's break down each of those. Firstly, we have those people who, as we said, just can't do it. So when we say that they can't do it, essentially, once again, we're looking at two different camps. There are those that can't do it because they are incapable of doing it, and there are those that can't do what it is we ask of them because they just don't have the skills. So with the latter, hopefully we've already covered that off. You know how to handle that. We sit down with them, we identify the skills that need work, we come up with a plan, and off they go to grow those particular areas wherein they are deficient. But it's the other group, those that are incapable, that we now need to understand. So there are some people that no matter what it is you do, they just don't have the capacity, they don't have the bandwidth to grasp the concept, what it is that you're trying to accomplish. When we talk about incapable, here what we're meaning is that the individual lacks the capacity or the ability to complete a specific or particular task. Again, as an example, how many of you could right now drop tools and without any further ramp up in training, go out and run the Hawaiian Ironman. Well, right now, where you sit, you are incapable of doing just that. And so we know that there are just some salespeople that are incapable of doing the work. They just can't do it. They don't have the smarts, they don't have the IQ, they don't have the bandwidth to process the kind of information that you need them to process to go out and make a sale. So as an example, we know that today salespeople, especially if they're selling business to business, need a new language. They need to understand the language of value. They need to understand the language of finance. It's no longer acceptable for them to be going out selling features and benefits. If you want to talk to CEOs, to CFOs, to general managers, you must understand the language of business. You must understand the language of finance. In other words, you need to be able to show how, as an example, your product or service will improve the cash flow of their organization, as an example. Do you even understand the impact that your product or service will have on cash flow, and what the ramifications will be for the organization, and how long it would take them before they can get into a cash flow positive situation, etc.? And so this is the language that salespeople need to learn how to speak if they're going to be effective in a B2B selling environment. Well, here's the thing. Not every salesperson is able to grasp these principles. And really, they are more comfortable selling to procurement officers and way down in the organization because they don't have to be tested on their business acumen. And often, because they are incapable, these are the salespeople that we've referred to in a previous program as lemons. They're not bad people, they're just incapable of doing what it is we need them to do. And then, of course, there's the second group of people who don't do what we ask of them because they simply choose not to. They won't do it. So let's unpack this. Let's understand what's really going on behind this I choose not to. Well, firstly, let's understand, are they choosing not to because they want to be obstreperous? They just want to be defiant. If you say it's black, they'll say it's white. Whatever you say, they just resist. They don't want to do it because you've told them to do it. So yes, there are a group of people that are, let's just say, disobedient, and in some cases quite hostile in their defiant behavior towards authority. But I'm not really talking about this group of people, mainly because most organizations will have some sort of policy or procedure that deals with corporate disobedience. Rather, what I want to look at today is really how people make choices. So how come you will give them an instruction to do A and they'll do B? Why is that? You see, people make choices based on all the facts that they have in front of them. They now make what they believe is the best choice. Now that best choice might be the wrong choice, but it's still what they thought is the best choice. In other words, with all the data, with all the research, with all the input, and their own personal baggage that they bring to the decision at that point, they make a choice. And so this is why there'll be some times where you give somebody an instruction and they'll go out and they will do what they think is the right thing, what they think you were asking of them, and they come back having completed a completely different task. And you pull your hair out in frustration and wonder why they just don't get it. And then when you ask them why they did it that way, they say, well, that's what I thought you wanted. So when faced with processing a decision, they run through all their data through their own filters and come up with the answer. And therefore they choose often the wrong answer. And so this is really where it becomes so critical for you as a manager to own your communication. Crystal clear communication begins with the communicator taking full responsibility to ensure that the message has gotten across. And in fact, the number one rule in communication is, and this is a big one, the number one rule in communication is miscommunication is the rule. So what does that mean? That means, again, that if miscommunication is the rule, then 99.9% of the time your message is not going to get through, in which case we really need to check to make sure that our message matches up with their perception of what they thought we said. So often then, the reason that people aren't doing what it is we want them to do is because there was a miscommunication. So if you recall, we said the first group of people who choose not to are choosing not to purely because they are just defiant. Then you have a group of people who are choosing not to because their filtering system is different to ours, and maybe we haven't communicated clearly enough. Now, in the book Bulletproof Your Sales Team, I actually refer to a fellow by the name of Ferdinand Fornese, who wrote a book called Coaching for Improved Work Performance. Now, Fornese himself points out 16 major reasons why employees don't do what they're supposed to. So let me just read them out real quickly. And as I list them, I want you to think about which of these reasons wouldn't actually even exist in the face of good quality coaching. Number one is they don't know why they should do it. And as we've discussed so often in this series, they're really helping the individual to understand the why. This is an important ingredient in the coaching process. In fact, it's been said that leadership is all about the why, whereas management is about the what. And then, of course, training and coaching is about the how. And remember what we said last time? The what now. What must they go and do right now to implement what we've just discussed? Number two, they don't know how to do it. Well, we've covered that. Number three, they don't know what they're supposed to do. Number four, often they think your way is not going to work. And number five is the other half of that. They think their way is better. And so, in other words, they're choosing not to do it your way. And then number six, they think something else is more important. Again, so they've put it through their filtering system and they've thought that something else is more important. And then according to Fornese, number seven is that they think they actually are doing it. So very often the problem is that they're not getting the feedback they need to get them back on track. So in their own mind, they think they're doing the right thing. And here's an interesting one. On his list, number 8 says that often the reason they don't do what they're supposed to do is because they're actually getting punished for doing it. So the classic example of this is you have an individual who always does the right thing, they always exceed their budget, and of course what happens is because they are so reliable, we tend to load them up with a whole lot more work. So in fact, in their mind, somewhere they perceive that they're actually being punished for doing a good job. Number 9 talks about the fact that they're rewarded for not doing it, and we're going to talk more about rewards in just a while. Number 10, they're scared, so they're anticipating the negative consequences of doing it. So a classic example of this is cold calling. For some people, they have such a fear of cold calling that it completely immobilizes them. And often this is because the pictures they're making up in their head of the consequences are so traumatic that they just keep doing nothing. Number 11, Fornese talks about that there's no positive consequences for them actually doing it. So there's no praise, there's no reward, there's no incentive. And number 12 is that there's no negative consequences if they don't do it. So nobody's coming down on them because they're not doing it. I mean, I'm working with an organization right now where some of their salespeople haven't hit their sales numbers in some cases, 18 months, and in one case, 2 years. Well, they obviously don't think there's anything wrong with that, because obviously there's no negative consequences of them not hitting their numbers. Then number 13 is that sometimes there are just obstacles beyond the individual's control. So they don't have the position power in order to make things happen. Number 14 is very often they believe that nobody can do it. So if they believe that it just cannot be done, well, they won't even attempt it. Number 15, it's beyond their personal limits. So in their mind, it's way beyond what they even expect of themselves. And finally, number 16 is that they have personal problems, and that stops them from doing what it is we've asked them to do. When you think about the coaching process, and you think about that everything that it encompasses, all the way from setting expectations to understanding the individual's motivational footprint, you can really see that the vast majority of these reasons and others pretty much become non-events. All right, so we've just taken a look at all the reasons why people don't do what we want them to do. Now let me give you the process for how to handle people that don't want to do what we need them to do, or more importantly, what they've already agreed to do. So let me give you the 4-step process that we use for dealing with what we'll call non or poor performance. Step number 1 is we need to ensure that each individual on the team understand that they are responsible for the outputs of the job box that they're managing. Okay, so what do I mean by this? What is a job box specifically? So picture a corporate organizational chart, a corporate hierarchy. Each box in this hierarchy exists to deliver certain outputs. If these boxes do not deliver their output, then the boxes above them cannot deliver their outputs, and so on up the line it goes. So we know that every role in an organization has been put there to deliver certain outputs and outcomes. And there's certain inputs that need to go into that role, and of course there's certain outputs that need to come from that. Now what changes is that as soon as you put a person into the box, now all of a sudden the box no longer is just about the role and the role's outputs. The box is about the person. The box is now about Mary. So if we were just managing boxes, that takes all the emotion out of our decision making, because the box either achieved the output or the box didn't. However, when we put Mary into the box, now all of a sudden there are a whole host of other things that impact how we manage that box or not. So if Mary's been around in the organization for the last 10 years and everybody loves Mary, and come birthdays, Mary's always there with the cake, and Mary organizes the morning teas, etc., etc., and everybody loves Mary, then how do we hold Mary accountable to the outputs required from the box? This is when it becomes difficult. So the first thing we have to do is, when we sit down with Mary, is we have to explain to Mary the outputs required of that box. Now if you think about it, the reason that Mary was hired was really to manage the output, the delivery, the KPIs required of that box. That's all. Mary has been hired to manage that box. And at the moment, that box is not delivering what that box needs to deliver. So whether the box itself is a territory, or whether the box is a group of customers, or whether the box is a specific product line, at the end of the day, everybody is managing a box that is required to deliver key performance outcomes. So Mary has a choice to make. What does Mary need to do in order to start to deliver the outputs required of that box? Okay, so note, now the conversation is not about Mary. It's not about whether Mary has a bad attitude or not, or whether Mary is good at her job or she's not good at her job or anything like that. All we really focused on is the outputs of Mary's box. That's it. And in sales, the outputs are easy. They are the numbers. These are the productivity goals that we have set for that particular box. We know that if that box makes their 120 calls in a fortnight, that box will ultimately produce X amount of opportunities, and out of those opportunities will come X amount of sales. We know that. And so therefore we hire somebody to deliver and to manage that box so that it can deliver the outputs required, the activities, the actions, everything that it takes to ultimately achieve that job box's outcomes. So hopefully that makes sense for you. Hopefully now you get that as a manager, your job is to make sure the delivery of the outcomes of the box. As the manager, you're really project managing the output of all the boxes of your sales team. So hopefully now you get why we say you cannot manage people. You can manage things, you can manage outputs, but you cannot manage people. We lead people and we coach people. Sure, as a coach, you're working with an individual one-on-one. But as a manager, you're managing the outputs of the box. This has got nothing to do with Mary as a person. It's got to do with Mary's box. It's got to do with Mary's ability to manage her box so that her box delivers the outcomes required. And many times, unfortunately, you have people on your team that don't understand the requirements and the responsibilities required of the job role or the job box that they're actually managing. So when it comes to dealing with performance, really the first step is for you to highlight the outputs required of the job role of the box. Then step number 2 is really you have to agree on the performance issue. So what specifically is the area of non-performance? Can we both agree on that? If the individual you're working with doesn't understand that there's a problem, then they're never going to fix it. So together you both have to come to an agreement. They have to understand, and you both have to agree on the specific issue that is roadblocking performance. So this means that together you both need to work to clearly define the problem. Because once we define the problem, now we can go and fix it. But the first piece of the puzzle is clearly what is the problem. And this is where it really takes your coaching skills. This is where you really have to tune in and listen and peel back and unpack and peel back and unpack and get really to the heart of this onion. What is it that is really the problem here? So once we've identified the problem and once we've specified exactly what the problem is, well, now we can go in and we can use our ICSA model that we've spoken about already as a problem-solving tool. So you may recall the ICSA model is issue, cause, solution, and action. So the first thing we're going to do is identify the issue, exactly what it is, and hopefully we've done that. Then, okay, so what are the causes of that issue? And we're going to list all the causes of that issue. And once we've got all the causes, we're going to rank them in terms of what the individual thinks is the most important cause. Then we're going to take that cause and then we're going to brainstorm solutions. So what are all the things we can do to solve that problem? So what are all the things that we can do to get to the heart of the matter? What can we do to remove the cause? And we'll brainstorm a whole lot of solutions. Now, once you've got your solutions, the next step is to get the individual to rank the solutions in terms of which one they feel would be the most appropriate. Which one do they think will achieve the best outcome? Then we take that solution and now you get them to brainstorm some activities, some actions that they need to implement in order to solve that problem. And this is how, by using the ICSA model, you can help them to overcome their problems, their issues. And then step number 4 is you doing regular follow-up during your sales performance coaching sessions to ensure that they're implementing the solutions that you've come up with together. All right, so now we've come to the final piece of the individual sales performance model. How do we motivate an individual? And this is the piece where we talk about rewards and recognition. Folks, as sales leaders, as sales managers, as a sales coach, it's of critical importance that you find out what reward would be most meaningful for the individual if they achieve or if they exceed our expectations. And this is why the motivational footprint is so important, because once we understand what their footprint is, now we know how to reward them for exceeding our expectations. If you have invested the time to identify what it is that's going to drive that individual, now all you need to do is keep them focused on the prize. And in that way, you'll get the kind of production, the kind of sales activity that you're looking for. Now, that being said, there's a vital principle that you must understand about rewards that we need to cover off here today. And this follows an age-old psychological principle, which is really fundamental for you to know if you want to drive behavior through rewards and incentives. And the principle is like this. The principle says, you get the behaviors you reward. And in fact, this is one of the very first lessons that someone studying psychology will learn. And that is, a behavior that is rewarded tends to be repeated. And this, in fact, is known as Thorndike's law of effect. And the fact is, we teach our salespeople what we deem to be important by what we focus on and what we reward and punish. Now, often, unfortunately, we give our salespeople mixed messages. And often we inadvertently reward them for the very behaviors and for the very attitudes we actually wish to discourage. And we also do the opposite. In other words, we also unintentionally discourage those behaviors that we actually want to promote. So let me give an example of what I mean. In a sales team, it's not unusual to find one or two salespeople who've been given public praise and acknowledgement. But here's the thing. What if the person being praised finds the public accolades embarrassing? Well then, if they do, they're going to avoid doing those very things for which they receive their recognition. They're going to stop performing so well because they don't want the public recognition. On the other hand, another example is, let's say you've got a salesperson whose name is Johnny, and Johnny is disrupting in sales meetings. Now, Johnny also happens to be one of your best producers in the team. But he's also the class clown, so he's always cracking jokes and poking fun at others, and often can be very disruptive. Now the problem is, as long as you as the sales manager avoid conflict with Johnny, and you look the other way, and the rest of the team all laughs at Johnny's jokes, then really Johnny's negative behavior is actually being rewarded, and it's going to continue. Why? Because he's actually being rewarded for his poor performance. He has to keep doing what he's been doing to keep getting the rewards and the accolades that he's been getting. This is really no different to the child who wants mum's attention, and every time mum's attention is diverted away from the child starts to sulk. And if mum keeps rewarding that behavior by coming over and cuddling and hugging and giving the child the attention that the child is looking for, then inadvertently mum is rewarding that behavior. And is it any wonder why we have people walking around corporations today that when they don't get their own way, when they don't get the attention, they sulk? Folks, this is just basic human psychology. We get the behaviors we reward. In fact, I'll share another classic example with you, and this is a huge one. I actually wrote about it in Bulletproof Your Sales Team. As I recall, there was a sales manager whose name was Jo, and she wanted to encourage her people to be creative and to be innovative, and she had this slogan on her desk which says, "I give you permission to fail." The problem was, when one of her team would go out on a limb to either win a customer or to keep a customer, and they overstepped their authority, Jo would react by telling them that they were being irresponsible, and she would come down on them from a dizzy height. And so it wasn't long before people got the message that, hey, around here, it's best to keep your head down rather than be innovative and creative. In other words, everybody just thought and everyone just felt that she just gave lip service to those key motivating principles. So let me translate this principle into your workplace. When you look at your incentive programs, what do our incentive programs really motivate? What behaviors are driven by our incentive programs? And do they motivate the right people doing the right things? So again, we look at the law of cause and effect. What is the effect of the cause? Is our incentive program rewarding the right things? And as a result, are you getting the right responses? Because when you look at the impact of cause and effect in your organization, and you just look at the effects, you look at the results, it doesn't take long when you peel back on those effects to find out what the cause is. And often the cause is that people are being rewarded for doing the wrong thing. How many times have your salespeople missed their target, and yet they're still on board with you? Yeah, fair enough, you've sat down with them, you've had a chat, you've said it's unacceptable, and yet they're still with you. That individual gets that actually hitting the targets doesn't really matter. So we've got to be careful that we reward only those activities we want to receive. This is the old Pavlov dog example. We'll ring the bell, the dog salivates, because they've been trained to salivate. Because every time Pavlov would feed the dogs, he would ring the bell at the same time. Pretty soon all Pavlov had to do was just ring the bell and the dogs would salivate. Well, this same theory applies to us as human beings. We do both positive and negative behaviors because we are rewarded for doing so. If you just take any negative behavior, take any negative dysfunctional behavior that you might have, there's obviously, as Dr. Fool would say, there's a payoff. And the payoff for doing that dysfunctional behavior is bigger than the reward for not doing it. And so hence we keep doing it. So when it comes down to rewarding individual behavior, as I said, number one, find a way to reward the individual for either meeting or hopefully for exceeding your expectations. And the way that you reward that individual must be tailored to suit that individual. So I'll share a great example of what I'm talking about. Working with an organization a few months back, and we were totally overhauling their incentive program. They knew their program wasn't working. They had an incentive program that just took you forever just to work out how much commission you'd made. It was just a mess. Just so happened that there was a lady who was one of their top producers on the team, and she'd been steadily getting more and more demotivated. And so when we interviewed her, what we discovered was that all she really wanted, she didn't want any more money. What she wanted was to be able to take off Friday afternoon from about 2 o'clock to go and fetch her girls from school. That's all she wanted. So to cut a long story short, because there were many things we had to put into place in order to make this happen, she got the incentive that drove her, that motivated her. She worked her tail off between Monday and Friday lunchtime. Her production was up, her sales were up, and she's now become consistently their top producer. So there's an example of how one needs to tailor the incentives and the rewards to the needs, to the drives, to the motivations of the individual salesperson. Everybody is different. Everybody has different drivers. You need to identify what those are and then set up an incentive that pulls them towards it. There is one last piece of the motivational puzzle, which is a study all on its own. And we really don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of the study here today. But that being said, I want to just give you a broad overview. So the study is primarily focused around the principle that excellent performance is primarily based on identifying and applying and developing an individual's strengths. So this concept of management by strengths came as a result of research by the Gallup organization, specifically two researchers, a fellow by the name of Marcus Buckingham and another by the name of Donald O. Clifton. And essentially what the research shows is that an effective manager doesn't emphasize weaknesses and limitations, but rather they work on an individual based on their strengths. Now, for more information on this subject, I'm going to highly suggest that you go and pick up a book called And Now Discover Your Strengths. And if you haven't read it already, it's really a worthwhile read. The added benefit of this book is, at the very back, you'll actually get a code which will allow you to go online and complete a profile through the Gallup organization, and you'll actually discover your own top 6 signature strengths. The beauty is, if you went out and actually bought a book for each one of your salespeople, you can have them go online, fill out the profile, and now you'll have a really definitive idea of what their strengths and their talents are, so that you can really go to work to mine them and use them as a very powerful motivational tool. But for right now, just come into my common sense corner for a moment. Over the years, by now, you probably would have had your own fair share of performance appraisals. And in those performance appraisals, no doubt, it was listed the areas that you needed improvement on. I'm also going to make an assumption that even still today, those would still be weaknesses on your performance appraisals. Because we know that really, even if we go to work on our weaknesses, we can maximum get 10 or 15% improvement. The whole philosophy behind strength motivation is, once we identify an individual strength, now we've got to work to help the individual optimize that strength. And that's a huge motivator. So I highly recommend pick up a copy of And Now Discover Your Strengths by Marcus Buckingham. Finally, the last thing I will say about motivation is, you as the motivator need to get really good at giving specific feedback. And that's really going to be the subject of our final web clinic. We're going to look at all the aspects of how we deliver feedback. It's that important that we've devoted a whole web clinic just to that subject alone. So let's wrap up here today. And in wrapping up, I want to give you the steps that you need to take if you want to start to drive the M, if you want to start to drive the motivation of the individuals on your sales team. So let's wrap up here today, because we've gone way over time. I'm going to give you the action steps that you need to take to implement motivation into your sales team. Well, step number 1 and step number 2, you've already completed. So step number 1 essentially is having that expectations discussion with the individuals on your team and really understanding what they expect of you as their sales leader. Step number 2 then would be finding out what their skill gaps were and implementing a process to get them upskilled to be able to accomplish what they need to accomplish to achieve their sales results and obviously meet your expectations. Then at some point, you're going to have to sit down with each one of your salespeople and you're going to have to gather data so that you can complete a motivational footprint on each of the individuals in your team. Then once you know what it is that drives them, then you're going to obviously go out and test to see whether in fact you've actually got the right motive in place. I also highly recommend that you go out, pick up a copy of And Now Discover Your Strengths, and actually complete a Strength Finder profile on each one of your salespeople. This will give you a really good understanding of their natural gifts, their natural talents, and how you can use those gifts, how you can use those talents to motivate and to drive them. But let me just say this. If you do nothing else as a result of today's session, have the discussion to determine their motivational footprint. Just that discussion alone will completely revamp the individual motivation and will give you some tools that will allow you to press the buttons to get them up and running. And just as a final footnote, let me just remind you that each one of your people are individuals, and therefore they need to be individually motivated. Folks, it's been a huge session today. Thank you so much for your time. Until we catch up next time, let me ask you, what are you doing today that's going to ensure the success of your sales team tomorrow? See you next time. Cheerio.